Lisa Keefauver is a social worker turned grief and empathy activist, using her personal and professional experiences with loss over the past 20 years to create what she calls a grief-smart culture. As founder of Reimagining Grief and as host of the podcast, Grief is a Sneaky Bitch, she is transforming and expanding our understanding of grief and changing the lives of individuals, communities, and organizations along the way. Lisa uses her warmth, honesty, vulnerability, and I can assure you her humor, along with her keen therapeutic skills to help people transform experiences of profound loss into hope. You can learn more about Lisa and her work by visiting reimagininggrief.com. Lisa, it's such a pleasure to have you. Welcome to PDYs.
Thank you so much for having me, Allan. Absolutely my pleasure, for sure.
I've been looking forward to this conversation so long, so let's get into it.
Yeah.
You have a very successful practice and podcast, and lots of people know who you are and know your story, but many in the PDYs community may not. And for those who don't, let's start with having you tell us how you became a grief and empathy activist.
Okay, well, again, thanks for this opportunity to chat with you. Nobody really grows up thinking, when I grow up, I want to be a grief and empathy activist, but such as it is, it really is a blend, as you mentioned, of the personal and professional experiences I've had in my life. I've been a social worker, fortunate to be a social worker for the last nearly 20 years. And though I didn't specialize early on in grief, I certainly recognized along the way many of the presenting issues that were coming up in the work that I was doing in foster care, adoption, clinical crisis intervention, public housing, really had unacknowledged and unprocessed grief at the root. And yet, even in the social work community at that time, I didn't feel like that was being addressed. And then it happened to me when I was 40. In 2011, my husband was 44 after a year of misdiagnosis. He died of a massive brain tumor. And I looked around and found both in my social work community and my personal community that people were really ill-equipped to talk about grief openly and honestly, and to really lend keen support. Through that and some other losses over the years and other work that I've done, founding nonprofits related to cancer, among other things, I recognized that I couldn't stop thinking about the power of empathy and holding space and bearing witness, the universality of grief and loss, and yet the lack of sort of cultural knowledge, acceptance practices. That in my narrative training just had me leaping sort of off the cliff and creating Reimagining Grief and creating the podcast, as you mentioned. And I literally spend my days and nights talking and thinking about grief and empathy.
Yeah, and I love so many things about your work. And one of the things I just really respect about what you've done is you've turned, unimaginable loss into something that helps, I presume, you, but also helps so many other people. And you and I have talked about sort of when you're handed something in life that you really have no control over, you have some decisions to make about sort of how you go forward. And I can imagine you having made lots of different decisions, but I'm really glad that you landed on the ones you've made, and I benefit from that work, and I know so many others do as well. There are lots of ways to think about, certainly, and to talk about loss and grief, and lots of ways to help people navigate those experiences. What do you typically advise or advocate that others consider after they've experienced a profound loss?
I'll give you some practical tools and advice and things, but I thought it might be helpful to the PDYs community to help explain how I think about grief and loss, which I think is much more expansive than traditionally. We often think about grief as being, of course, related to death loss. This community understands, of course, that we experience grief because in anticipation of loss or because of loss of abilities or functioning, et cetera. I know this community knows that well. So the metaphor I use is that our lives are built by millions of experiences, and then we start to form our identities by the stories that we create. And when we have a profound loss, which, as you were just mentioning, can be death, but can be a diagnosis, an illness, an absence in some way, or even an unfulfilled dream, it's akin to the manuscript of our lives being torn to shreds. And so the reason I bring and then our work in grief really is to sort of rewrite and live into this new story that we're co-creating.
Right.
And the reason I use that description to think about the work that we do, or how we might navigate grief for ourselves, I think is your question. How would we think about navigating grief?
Yeah.
Is to really think about giving ourselves grace and patience and permission to fumble and be, and trip and fall. I think part of what our biggest struggles in grief is all of these, and we might talk about this later, but these cultural expectations that we have amongst ourselves and others have of us, that we have to get it right, that there's a right way to do it, that there's a timeline. So I think sort of broadly, my best advice is to offer yourself the kind of compassion and empathy you would offer a best friend who is taking on a new path that's never been that path has never been trailblazed before. Even though we've all experienced grief, you've never experienced this grief.
Right.
If you want to talk about some sort of practical things to approaching it, we can certainly talk about therapeutic support, et cetera, but I want to check in with you.
Yeah, let's come back to that. And I appreciate the way you reframed the question, because I really was getting at what you were talking about. Sort of how do you think about sort of where to start and sort of what's what goes into sort of framing, if you will, a sort of way into an experience of loss before you get to the sort of tips.
What do you do about it?
Helps. Yeah.
Naming it. I really think the first thing that most of us don't do for ourselves, for each other in community, is really naming a lot of things as loss. We tend to pathologize them as some kind of behavioral or diagnosis. Not that there aren't legitimacy to certain diagnoses, but I think how I approach it is really, I'm often just trying to name and normalize it, and to broaden what we even think about grief. We tend to think about it as emotional only, but grief is cognitive and financial, emotional, existential, of course, physical. It's an embodied response. So I think starting there is the best. We can't do anything else if we don't start there, if we don't name it and claim it.
Right. And as you say so well, there's risk involved. It requires vulnerability, particularly when it goes against sort of the social norms or customs of the day. We, in the North American context, generally speaking, we don't do well with loss, much less, with how to respond to losses. And, in the PD community, you and I have talked some about my experience with Parkinson's and others on your podcast, which will be coming up, and I'll ask you to say more about that.
I'm so excited. Yeah.
But anticipatory loss and the grief that comes with that is really part and parcel of many of our experiences in the Parkinson's community, because you receive a diagnosis. There's a slate of losses, if you will, that sort of come immediately. And then there's the loss that's tied to, or the losses that are tied to what we anticipate life might be like for us a year from now, 5 years from now, 10, 20 years from now, right? So it's imagined, but it's anticipatory because we expect these things to happen. What would you say about that? I mean, I know you have some experience with this, personal and professional. What would you say about that?
Again, I think just beautifully what you said was so great, is just to name it. I think we sometimes give people permission to sort of understand their grief over the diagnosis, but what about all of the secondary losses? And what about the fact that, as you said, how do you stay in the present while you're anticipating this, maybe the prognosis not being good, what will happen going forward? So I think, again, acknowledging it, reminding everybody in the care community around that individual, they may be experiencing their own anticipatory grief, just as maybe the person who's been diagnosed is experiencing that. I also think, when I think about the Parkinson's community, I think about this, even my husband went a year acting not himself without a diagnosis. And I think about all the ambiguous loss on top of the anticipatory grief that we experience too. And I don't think I can imagine that those two things can't really be detangled when you're thinking about living with Parkinson's, because we don't quite know what is coming next. And that sort of ambiguity, back to our story metaphor, is really hard for us because we like knowing and we like certainty and we like understanding what's next. That gives us a sense of safety and security. So I think understanding that the embodied response, both from the caretakers and the patient themselves, is going to be a kind of stress response because we're having to, the ground beneath us is shifting all the time, I think is one way I would say.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. The ambiguous loss. Absolutely. Right. I mean, some things we can sort of name, and then sometimes we have feelings, but we don't really know what they are, how to name them. And I think that's absolutely certainly.
And you're there, but you're not there, or, you have an opportunity, but it's not quite the same. You don't know what's coming. And that kind of earth shifting between you is really challenging, and it requires a different kind of intervention, I think, than some other types of losses. Yeah.
Yeah. Really well said. I really appreciate that. Lots of us have experience with, or will have experience with, losses that we sort of get stuck in. We've acknowledged the loss, or we've given ourselves permission to name it, and then for whatever reason we sort of get stuck, and that can look differently for different people. But what do you think about getting stuck, and sort of some reasons for that, and sort of where we go from there if we are in fact stuck in our grief?
Yeah. Grief can be really sticky. There's a stickiness to grief. I think, again, when I can't ever have a conversation about grief without having all the cultural perspectives that make things sticky. I do think grief is sticky for lots of very good reasons. And then there are some problematic reasons. I will say up front, I think we tend to label grief as stickier. We tend to label culturally grief as sticky in a sort of pathologizing way because we're impatient and we want people to get over it and move on. So while I'm going to give an answer to the stickiness, I do want to sort of put out there that I think we also have to give ourselves and others permission to sort of sit in the suck, as one of my guests said on my podcast, and to sort of be in the grief for some time. But I think sometimes the stickiness that happens for grief, again, is because this is a path we've never traveled before. It requires us to experience a level of emotional distress that most of us haven't experienced before. But also, again, coming back to, we don't have often, many of us, the language, the therapeutic insight, the support communities to really allow those emotions, which need to be seen and held, to be seen and held and to be experienced. And so I often think the people that I've seen who I would label as having really gotten stuck, again, I use that word really with quotes because I don't like to be pathologizing, are people who sort of named it, but then try to get busy, not processing the emotions, not attending to their physical reactions, not attending to the emotional, the psychological, understanding the cognitive, and they tried to sort of run from it. And I think I use this metaphor all the time. We have to invite our emotions over for a cup of coffee. They just need to be seen and held, and then they'll be on our way. But most of us try to sort of keep our emotions, especially the ones we don't like, at the door, but then they just loom large outside. And so for me, I think even the places along the way in my own grief journeys, I've had multiple, lost a dear friend a few years after losing my husband, have been when I resisted experiencing whatever emotional and distress I had, or resisted attending to the physiological, realities of grief. And so I think this might not be the answer folks want to hear, but I think the stuckness happens when we resist, allowing grief to teach us and move us and shape us in the ways that it needs to be. That can be really scary and intimidating, which is why you'll want to find communities of support and outlets that will help you ease that distressing time. But I think that's what I would say the biggest reason people get stuck is really actually their effort to sort of escape attending to their grief.
Yeah. Yeah, and you mentioned the community piece. I want to linger there for a little bit. I know in my own experience, which I've talked a lot about and written a lot about, and you and I have talked about, which isn't unusual in my experience in talking with others, is my first response to this diagnosis was to sort of go underground, right?
Yeah.
And do it alone. And there are lots of reasons for that, some constitutional, some socialization, all of the above. But the community piece really is important, isn't it? And I think, my own experience bears this out, and lots of others whom I've talked with say the same, that, in the Parkinson's world anyway, once you find that community and you are appropriately vulnerable in that community, and you receive other people's vulnerabilities, you feel better, you integrate your losses in more effective ways, you build new relationships that you invest in, all of that. I'm assuming you would agree that that's important for all of us, right? To find that sort of opportunity for community. But what else would you say about that?
Yeah, no, I loved what you said. I think it's really true. And whether we're talking about, grief, loss, diagnosis, kind of the whole spectrum of any kind of distressing state is, first of all, again, yes, very normalized for us to kind of want to go private. First of all, reinforced by culture, like keep your problems to yourself. We're taught to be strong and independent, lots of things. So that retreat isn't surprising nor pathologizing. That's a pretty typical reaction for most people. So don't judge yourself if you were one of those too. But I think it really cuts to the core of our human nature. We are story creatures, and we need to belong. That is at our very, physiological, neurobiological core, right? We need to belong and be in community. And part of what happens when we experience, a catastrophic illness or a death loss or some kind of event is that we kind of feel in isolation. There's a severing from ourselves, from our own identity, kind of who we were before and after. And then because we don't really know how to navigate, we sort of feel this disconnect between us and others. And because culturally others don't know how to show up and support for us. So I think it's almost nearly impossible to do the healing work of grief and growth without some level of belonging. Now, that might be a support group with people, who are experiencing the same thing. I certainly participated in a support group with spouses. I had my daughter, who was 7 at the time of my husband's death, go to a child support group. But I also had friends who hadn't experienced grief who managed to figure out how to show up, mostly, as I say, show up, shut up, and listen. They just came and sat on the floor with me while I cried. There wasn't really a lot of doing. So how you connect with other people and people who've had shared experiences might be up to you, your personal style and your circumstances. But I 100% agree that we love in community, and we have to heal, and we get broken in community, and we have to heal in community. Mm-hmm. So I think seeking that belonging, seeking that place where someone can hold space and bear witness to you, to your pain, is, you can't bypass that, and I think part of that's what's been really struggling for people in the last year and a half of the pandemic, is feeling that they didn't have the same kind of course, we got technology and we figured out other ways, but when we can't be seen and held in the ways that we're sort of, again, neurobiologically wired to do, it's hard to do that emotional work of grief and to do the healing work that we need to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I want to shift a little bit to not that you can sort of separate these out, but in the Parkinson's community, we talk a lot about the person with Parkinson's, and then that person's family and care partners, right? Who they sustain their own losses with a diagnosis like Parkinson's, and their own plans for the future are often sort of changed, or at least they envision those being changed, and all of that. So, what might you say to family members of a person who has been diagnosed with Parkinson's, or is living that diagnosis some years out, or care partners in particular? What might you say to them?
Some of the same things I would say to the patient, which is name it and claim all the different ways in which you're grieving. that's totally normal. That's a beautiful human response to a catastrophic change, to the shredding of your life story. Even though you aren't the one with the illness, you had future hopes, you had a dynamic in your relationship, you had expectations, et cetera. So I think naming and claiming and sort of honoring and validating maybe are better words, even the naming and claiming that your grief is valid and real, and it doesn't have to compete with the grief of the diagnosed patient, family member. They can live sort of side by side. I think the other thing I might say to care partners in particular is I see a lot of guilt and shame when there are feelings of anger, frustration, resentment, all of which are very normal responses to these shifts. And so I think if I was looking at a care partner right in the eye, I would say it's okay to be resentful or angry or tired or irritated or wish something to be different. And that does not negate your love or care or your willingness to show up. Again, the more we kind of keep even the emotions we don't like at the door, even when they're sort of anger or frustration or irritation, the more they loom large and come out sideways. We all know when we've sort of been passive aggressive or sideways. So I would say to a care partner, yes, you have to care for your person, but make sure you're caring for yourself. So you're not going to burden the patient with these emotions, possibly, although there are places and spaces where it's appropriate to talk about. But how are you finding your own communities of support where you find belonging, where you feel like you can share your story without judgment and being held? But giving yourself, honoring your own grief is, I think, not only does you a favor, it allows you to show up and be a better caretaker to the person that you're caring for. That's been my experience professionally and personally, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. There's, in my experience has been, there is a measure of freedom, for lack of a better word, that comes with sort of being blindsided and you're sort of left to figure it out. You're exposed and vulnerable in ways that maybe you never imagined. And then you sort of have to give yourself permission, or you hopefully give yourself permission to feel what you feel and to think what you think and to experience what you experience as you try to sort of navigate through that. And so I really, really appreciate, you're naming that and again, giving people permission to think in
Can I
those
add one more thing?
Yeah.
To the care partners and of course the patients too, but although I think the patients' bodies are often being attended to, I imagine, is the other thing is to not just notice the emotional and name and honor the emotional reactions you have, but care partners, as is the case often, put their physical needs last.
Yeah.
And we embody our emotions in our physical body. So when you're thinking about how you're showing up for support for yourself and seeking your own support, it's also about your own rest, your own nutrition, your own movement, your own meditation, mindfulness, whatever are the tools that serve you, because your body will hold on to things in ways that will, again, if you don't take care of it, you're not doing well, and then you're not going to be in service of the person you want to care for. So don't forget the embodied care.
Yeah. Yeah. So important.
Yeah.
So you talk to a lot of people, and you hear a lot of stories and get to reflect on those stories. Is there a story of someone's experience of loss that, particularly moved you, or that you found to be sort of particularly transformative, for the person, maybe for you? Anything you would share with us along those lines?
Well, you're right. I have had the incredible honor of course, interviewing, dozens and dozens of guests for my podcast, but also the people that I serve individually over the course of my career. When you asked that question just now, one of the people that popped into my mind was a guest that I had on my show in the first season of Grief as a Sneaky Bitch podcast. He had written this beautiful piece on Medium, and I was so taken by it, I had to contact him and say, I'm stalking you, please come on my show. And he was very gracious and did. His name is Kelly Abbott, and his young son, who was 3 years old, drowned at a preschool graduation party in front of everybody, basically. And he wrote this beautiful piece not too many years later about the work of grief. And that's how he framed it, about kind of, pushing that boulder one day at a time, about holding holding on to his memories, about honoring his sadness, about scheduling in his time, about giving himself, his wife, their other child permission, inviting everybody to give themselves permission. He spoke openly about his own use of EMDR to be really moving through the trauma of witnessing such a thing. He talked really interestingly about even the different grief styles that he and his wife had, but that though often these losses tear families apart, in their experience, they sort of clung to each other and are closer than ever. And he attributed that, of course, to the beauty and wisdom of his wife, as a good husband does. But he also really talked about the fact that they both were very open and vulnerable and committed to doing the work of grief, to sitting in the suck, as another guest said, to sort of attending to their emotions. He also spoke about the power of some people in his life who he thought would show up, didn't, but then the people he didn't think would show up on his doorstep with a cup of coffee, and hold space and bear witness. And his arc, when you think, of course, for those of you who are parents like me, like you, that seems like the absolute worst nightmare you can never come back from. But he just spoke with he didn't make light or, rainbows out of this tragedy. I'm not saying that. It wasn't sort of toxic positivity, but I could see that he had done the work. He continues to do the work. He shows up with all the tools at his disposal, writing and talking and therapeutic support and friendships, to really grow through his grief and to do it in community with his family and his broader community. So yeah, Kelly, his story, I think, is one that stands out. Although, as I said, I've had the honor of talking to so many people and serving so many people that it's always hard to pick one. If you ask me tomorrow, I might tell you a different story.
That's very, it's very moving. And it reminded me of of an image that I have borrowed for years from a therapist, well-known therapist named Dorothy Beckvar, who wrote a book 25, 30 years ago called In the Presence of Grief. And I think for me, that's an apt metaphor, because you sort of learn how to live in the presence of grief in ways that you hope are constructive over time and life-giving and all of that.
Yeah.
But it's still grief, right? You're still in the presence of it. And there are probably many experiences of grief that are always with you. The key becomes sort of, how do you live?
How does it shape you, and how do you let it, and how do you shape it? Yeah. And I think, is my favorite word. So I think you can hold grief, and can it be something that invites you to see awe, to see joy, to be in amazement more often. And I think that's, if I had to say some quality that I really appreciated about Kelly, is I think he did that. He honored the pain and the heartache of his grief. And I think he revels in the opportunity then to see the beauty in the little things and in life. And he did that through hard work. That wasn't just one day he woke up and decided, checked off a top 10 list, on the internet and did that. It's the daily work of grief.
Yeah, there's not a quick recipe for just sort of getting it done.
Boy, wouldn't we like that in our culture, right? Yeah, if you just take a Cosmo quiz and get it over with, but it doesn't work that way.
Yeah. Well, tell us more about Grief is a Sneaky Bitch, which is arguably the best name for a podcast ever. Tell us about that. Yeah.
Thank you. Actually, that title came to me almost 8 years before I started the show. I was at a party with a friend, thought I was doing well, reached in my purse, and for some reason, a printed out photo of me and my husband were in my purse. I don't even understand how it got there. And I just burst into tears at this party in front of people that I didn't know. And I looked at my good friend, who's one of my soul sisters, who shows up for me. And I just said, Grief's such a sneaky bitch. And then when I decided to do the podcast, there it is. And you're right, it is, because everybody I've met who've heard the show said, you know what, it is a sneaky bitch.
Yeah.
So the purpose and how the show has continued to evolve, my sort of tagline is changing the narratives of grief, one conversation at a time. And of course, that's a nod to my love of all things narrative and narrative approaches. But really the goal of the show, it's an interview format show. I was honored to have you on my show. You'll be on in season 3, which will be coming out this fall, 2021. But I wanted to have authentic, honest, like this, unscripted conversations with people who've experienced grief either or and at the personal or professional level of all different kinds of grief experiences, from, of course, death, loss to catastrophic injury, illness, migration, immigration, race, issues around race, etc. Because I wanted us to increase our capacity to have a vocabulary, for one thing, about how we show up for ourselves and others, to use it as a tool, just like we talked about today. But I also wanted it to be, in a way, this sanctuary for people who maybe don't have grief support communities or support groups that they can go to, or maybe are not in a space where they want to venture out in the world, and from the privacy of their earbuds, or at home, or on a walk, or at the gym. That's where I listen to my podcasts all the time, is, at the gym, that they could listen to conversations and feel seen and held. And when they heard a guest talk about being jealous or being angry or being sad, quote unquote, too long or whatever, they could see themselves reflected. And it's been, I think, season 2, I wrapped up earlier this summer, about 30 or so, 32 episodes. I had a few solo casts in there. And the expanse of guests that I've had so far have been really powerful. And one quick anecdote, if I can, I may have shared it with you before, but I think it's really powerful to the universality of grief, is I had a guest on my show talk about her grief over a medically terminated abortion she had. And that was disenfranchised grief. She didn't feel like she could grieve, even though she did this thing. And I had a woman write to me whose husband was killed in a hit and run accident, in a car accident. They never found the driver. It was, of course, a very traumatic situation. And she wrote to me so beautifully, I won't say all the details, about how hearing this other woman's story about a very different kind of grief, and the way she showed up with her vulnerability and what she said, and just the conversation and how I showed up even for my guest, completely shifted and transformed her own relationship with her grief. And she felt, in this way, very held and seen. And I just bring that up, not to, toot my own horn or pat myself on the back, but just to say, I think there's something really powerful about making visible all of our vulnerabilities, about making visible the kind of language we need to show up both for ourselves and for others, and to do it in different ways where people have access to it. As I said, from the anonymity of listening to a show, which is different than showing up for a group, although I'd say do both, of course, or show up for individual support. But the show has been phenomenal. This coming season, I have you on my show. I have guests who've experienced catastrophic injuries. I have fellow widows. I have John Powell of the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley talking about the very nature of belonging and grief. And of course, the context is, and the work he's done has been around civil rights and civil justice. So I'm continuing to expand how we even think about grief, what we call grief, and then bringing more and more thinkers to the table so that we can become, of course, my big vision is that we become a grief smart culture. And the show is one way I'm trying to help us achieve that mission or that vision.
Yeah, well, I just want you to keep doing what you're doing. I commend your podcast to everyone I have an opportunity to do that for. It's helped me. I look forward to season 3 and many more seasons, after that.
Thank you.
Maybe one final question for today, and I could talk to you for hours. But
I know. We might have a part 2 down the road. How about?
I would love that. What gives you hope, Lisa? I often tell my students that, we don't talk a lot in terms of universalities these days, for good reason. But I still sort of hang my hat on the belief that the grief, loss and grief are universal experiences. They take different shapes and forms and durations and all of that, perhaps, but everybody is going to experience loss. To live
100% of us, you're not getting out of here a lot. You're not getting out of here without it. Yeah.
Right. So in light of that, what gives you hope as someone who continues to live in the presence of your own losses, as I do, but as someone who tries to help others navigate those experiences too? What gives you hope?
Yeah, it's so funny. I've had listened to so many different great thinkers think about hope, and they don't really deal in hope. And, there's sort of a cynicism. And I think my my answer might be that I think about hope maybe in a different way. I think hope has been just like love. There's some words in our vocabulary that I think have been co-opted or not full enough. So I'm going to take some leeway here. I think about hope less in the sort of Pollyanna sunshine, just toxic positivity way that I think it's gotten a little co-opted into. And I think what gives me hope is my own journey, knowing that there was a day when I could not physically get off the floor. And there was a day when I couldn't imagine not crying every day. And then there was a day when I was not crying every day. And then there was a day when I, et cetera, et cetera. And the same thing I've witnessed with those that I've served, with the guests on my show, that gives me hope because we change. That is another universal truth, is there is always change. And so every time I sort of feel a kind of maybe hopelessness or a kind of lost, again, I give myself and others permission, but I remember I didn't always feel this way. And so there might be a chance that I won't always feel this way. So that's one thing I cling to when I think about hope, or when I feel open to the possibility of something. I think the other way I reframe it is I've personally experienced and witnessed so many people, I think you're certainly somebody, if I might say, has done this too, is that I've seen the ways in which grief transforms people's ability to, speaking of presence, to be present to awe, and to be present to joy, and to be present to amazement in ways that none of us were before grief became a companion in our life. And that's, to me, the beauty. That's the juice of life, is to be able to savor little moments and to see the awe in the everyday. And so when I can experience those moments for myself, or when I witness other people who've been through heartache, yourself, like when I talked about my guest, Kelly, and I see the ways they light up over sort of the everyday and the ordinary, I think that's like, if I just needed a little daily dose of that every day, that would keep me hoping every day. If I just got a little experience or vision of that, I think.
That's beautiful. Thank you. I mean, who you are and what you do keeps me hoping as well. And I just, it's an honor to have you speak to the PDWise community, who I know are going to benefit from your work as much as I have and so many others have. So again, thank you for your time and for your wisdom and for your generosity. Look forward to having you back in the future, and
sure,
to tuning into your podcast.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Allan, for having me. I love what you're doing as well. I love the community that you're creating, the vulnerability, the permission that you're giving folks to experience whatever they're experiencing in their journey. And I'm just honored to be a small part of it.
Thank you, Lisa. Talk to you soon.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.